Welcome to another edition of Copcast from Canadian Tactical Officers Association. I'm your host, Jim Bremner, and I'm delighted today to have Nir Maman, my managing director, with me in the studio today. And I've been away for a little bit. I'm back now, and we're going to talk about a number of things today. We have a special guest from Israel. I'll get Nir to introduce him. And today, I think we're going to talk a little bit about active shooter, counterterror, and tactics and how they evolve and how they're somewhat different in different parts of the world. So I'm looking forward to that. That said, we have a new sponsor in Hero Coffee, and that will be available in the CTOA store very soon. So keep your eyes open for that. And of course, there's always a discount to our membership. If you're looking to become a member, it's really simple. Just go on www.ctoa.ca and just follow the instructions. It's simple, and we'd like to have you on board. So one thing I'd like to say is we've had a change in our treasurer, Mike Brake, who's been with us from the very beginning, just a great guy. He stepped down as a treasurer, and now we have Craig Peddle. And so we're looking forward to bringing Craig Peddle on board with us. He's a great gang investigator, and again, lots of knowledge there. So that said, I'm going to turn it over to Nir, and Nir, tell us what we're going to do today.
All right, Jimmy. Thank you, my friend. Great to be here. I'm looking forward to this session. Hello, everybody who's with us. Thank you very much for joining. Well, I guess let me tell you how this got started, and then we'll figure out what we're doing as we go along here. As everybody knows, our passion is everything related to tactics and combat and warfare and everything in that nature. And we have with us today a special guest, Major Nadav Raz, who is joining us from Israel. He had a bit of an easy day. He was in reserve duty today, doing who knows what, and now he just finished his shift, and he's with us, and we truly appreciate it. Give you guys a little bit of a background on how we got here, and then we'll talk about what we're doing. I was sitting on the couch one day, as I do all the time these days, doing nothing, watching YouTube videos, and I happened to stumble upon an interview with Nadav, an interview that was being conducted by Moshe Konikov in Israel, who's a counterterror and Krav Maga instructor. And the subject had to do with tactical training and quick reaction intervention teams. So, of course, it caught my attention. I started listening, and I'm listening to this gentleman by the name of Nadav talk about his background. And as I'm hearing this, I'm thinking to myself, hold on a sec. You and I served in the same place. We did the same things, and I don't even know you. It's incredible. So we connected on Facebook, started a little conversation about all kinds of things related to where we've been, what we've done, the history of the different divisions that Nadav really started, that I ended up also taking over. Nadav, by the way, left the unit when I came into the unit, our counterterror unit. And, the conversations, as they do with you and me, Jimmy, I mean, it just goes on forever, and it goes in every direction because there's just so much to discuss. Yeah. We talk about our line of work here when it comes to the training and the actual tactical deployment of the methodologies and the expertise. And there's a big global tie-in here, not just what we do in Israel, but, a lot of what we have been doing in Israel and the threats that we have been facing in Israel, the whole world in the last about 15 years has become acquainted with very intimately. On the training side of it, respectfully to Nadav and me, aside from everything that we were tasked with doing as far as training at the Counterterror School, we also were in charge of training all of the Allied Nations Special Operations units that would be sent to the Counterterror School before they deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. And that in and of itself has a very, very interesting dynamic to it. And we figured, this just has a lot of synergy to it, just individually with our backgrounds. And then, as a whole with this subject matter, we got to turn this into a podcast. And so here we are. We're going to try to cover A lot of ground here. We have viewers joining us from all over the place. We've got IDF folks from Israel. We have law enforcement guys from North America. There's always a lot of questions. What we do, how we do it, why we do it, tactics one over the other, what works, what doesn't, what's it for. There's a lot of ground to cover there. One of the things that we're going to get into is terror attacks and the whole world of intervention, which, for us is our bread and butter in Israel, and here in North America is obviously a very heavy topic. It's a pandemic. It's a real pandemic, unlike some of these pandemics that are being pushed upon us these days. And there's a lot to discuss there as far as SOPs and methodologies and tactics. And in a nutshell, that's what we're gonna do. I will let Nadav give a little bit of a background on himself, and then we're going to start with a little bit of a video afterwards on our unit. To give a quick little snapshot that's going to segue into everything that we're talking about here, and we will take it from there. Nadav, my friend, Bruchim Habayim, thank you for joining us, for being with us. Please go ahead, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
So I am 40 years old. My name is Nadav Raz. I am actually an acupuncturist. That's what I do in day-to-day life. But I started my military career in the Nachal Brigade Regular Infantry, and I moved on to a trainer and officers course, and later on to the Counterterrorism School. We'll get into that a bit later. And while I was in the Counterterrorism School, I helped found a new unit that's called the School for Settlement Protection, which is in reserves. That's actually what I do today. For the past about 18 years, I've been in command of the School for Settlement Protection, where we train fast response units. Again, we'll talk about this a bit more during the podcast. But that's my reserve duty, which is something that I do about 60 days a year, maybe even more. That's the short of it. We'll get into it more.
No problem. So why don't we, just so that people have a little bit of an understanding of where you and I come from. We do come from a lot of the similar, a very similar pathway. You started out in the Central Command Infantry, Nachal Brigade. I started out with the Northern Command. We both ended up in the Counterterror Unit, which is also the IDF's Counterterror School. You helped establish the micro combat section, the modernized aspect of it at the Counterterror School, which was tasked with governing that subject. I was supposed to take over as commander of the micro combat school, which I opted not to. You were in charge of training the foreign units that would come to the school, which is exactly what I did as well. So we have a lot of similar pathway there. But why don't we just quickly take a few minutes here. I want us to look at this video that was put together by our friends at agilitegear.com. It's a video on our unit. It's going to give everybody not just a snapshot at what our unit is responsible for in the IDF and does, but also a quick little understanding of how our counterterror mandate in Israel came to be. And that kind of was the seed for everything that we do today, everything from the units that we have, the methodologies, the tactics. That's where it all started. And then we'll talk about the evolution, how things evolved, and why we do things the way that we do. So, Grant, you want to get that video going for us?
Unit 707, Lotar, is the authority on everything related to counter-terror warfare for the entire Israeli Special Forces. The unit has two functions within the IDF. First, it operates as the primary counter-terror school and is the sole certifying authority for everything related to counter-terror warfare. This includes certifying every counter-terror operator and unit within the Special Forces community in hand-to-hand combat, underground warfare, close quarters combat, sniping, tactical rappelling, and more. They are not only qualified command-level instructors. each Lotar operator conducts in-field operations throughout Israel in order to remain effective in their various teaching environments. The Lotar's second function is as an operational counter-terror unit under the central command. The unit has both a wartime operational role as well as maintaining readiness for hostage situations during peacetime. During designated wars, the Lotar unit may be deployed as an individual unit or may be attached to an infantry battalion for incursions into urban areas. During peacetime operations, the unit is tasked with a multitude of various mission profiles. These include high-risk entries, searches, and arrests of wanted terrorists throughout the West Bank, response and intervention to active terror attacks, and various other unconventional missions including hostage rescue and counterintelligence. Lotar was established in 1974 after the terror attack known as the Ma'alot Massacre. 3 armed Palestinian terrorists infiltrated into Israel from Lebanon and entered Netiv Meir Elementary School in Ma'alot, taking over 100 children hostage. A failed rescue attempt by Sayeret Matkal, the IDF's Tier 1 SF unit, resulted in the murder of 21 school children before the hostage takers were killed. Despite being heavily experienced at fighting complex wars, the IDF was not prepared for this type of threat. This gave birth to Israel's new national counterterrorism mandate. The mandate called for the creation of new laws and rules of engagement against terrorism, the creation of specialized counter-terror units, and the establishment of a new IDF Counterterror School that would govern the subject of counter-terror warfare and train these new units. Lotar was born. The unit has a recruitment process similar to all other special forces units in the IDF. It's comprised of several intensive interviews, psychological tests, and a 15-month qualification course. The course runs around 18 hours per day each day for its entire duration, covering a rigorous and intensive daily and nightly schedule of counter-terror warfare, tactical shooting, and Krav Maga. By the end of the unit's qualification course, approximately 25 recruits are left standing. They will have earned their Lotar counter-terror war pin and will only then officially enter the unit. Lotar is also in charge of governing all TTPs, tactics, techniques, and protocols deployed in the field by the entire IDF Special Forces. They are also responsible for developing any new TTPs required by units to address the new emerging threats they face at the hands of the multitude of terror organizations, ranging from Hezbollah and Hamas to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. If a new enemy TTP is discovered through intelligence or through an engagement in the field, or if a terror organization finds a way to counter any current TTPs of the IDF units, the Lotar is immediately tasked with developing a counter-TTP to ensure all units constantly remain in the most optimal disposition to defeat all terror threats they engage. With Israel constantly in the sights of the most battle-hardened terror groups who are determined to exterminate it at all costs, it is Israel's counter-terror capabilities that allow it to exist. During the day, the Lotar is busy perfecting the counter-terror capabilities of all the IDF's elite soldiers. At night, while the citizens of Israel sleep, Lotar warriors do their part in taking out the terror infrastructure that threatens Israel's existence.
Why don't you go ahead, Nadav? I'll let you open up with that.
Let me
So
ask as an outsider, why a counter-terror school? Why?
Why what?
Why a counter-terror school? Why?
Okay.
I know that might sound silly, but again, I'm asking from a North American Canadian perspective that we likely most Canadians wouldn't understand the need for that.
So the first thing is, what is the definition of counterterrorism? Because every unit or every country sort of has a different definition of it.
Yes.
So when we're talking about counterterrorism, originally in the 1970s, especially, we were talking about hostage rescue. That's actually not what's happening today. There were special units that focused on hostage rescue, and they were training in that. You didn't actually need a school for this. You had the special units, they trained themselves. That was about it. Cross-unit training also, SAS and that kind of stuff. But basically, each unit trained itself. But as terrorism became sort of different, if we're talking about active shooters, if we're talking about insurgency and counter-guerrilla, which I'll talk about later, we're basically talking about using the aspects of hostage rescue in day-to-day combat situations. If we're talking also about the reality in Israel, and I suppose also in Iraq and Afghanistan, where you're actually conducting combat within a civilian environment where not everyone is a combatant and not everyone is a terrorist. So you need to use those kinds of concepts, and you have to give them to all the units in the military, not just the special hostage rescue units. So that's like the basic idea of why you need a school, because you want to teach more and more units and not just the special forces. And aside from that, you also want the units to work cohesively together. So if you have a basic doctrine or a basic way of working and some type of big operation which needs to conduct several units together, you want them to talk the same language, not each one with their own system or their own techniques. So
Can I
that would be
ask-
why you need a school, I suppose.
I think that's interesting. And why do you think there's a reluctance in North America to download that tactical information to frontline police officers?
I think the problem is actually a similar problem we have in the IDF sometimes, and that's ego. We
Interesting.
do it better. We do it correctly. Our system is the best. It's the most proven system, and so forth. That's usually the reason why not. And I think also North America, you have an issue of jurisdiction between. You have a lot of different law enforcement units and stuff like that,
Yeah.
where I don't know, FBI, sheriff, police, SWAT, all these different things, which in Israel is relatively more cohesive in that matter. It's a bit easier to handle those things.
I see.
Let me just also add on to that, to your question, Jimmy, which was the lack of desire to really cross-pollinate on all the levels of tactical capabilities and response. You've got your TAC guys, your SWAT guys, you have your uniform patrol, you have whatever's in between, and everybody gets compartmentalized. And, I think that one of the biggest differences is that for us in Israel, we get forced to doing things. We don't have the luxury of choosing. When we will discuss in a little bit 1974, which was the pinnacle event that took place, the Malot High School incident, that was where we discovered we are not prepared for the world of counterterrorism. 1974, 3 terrorists breached the Lebanon border from the north, traveled across, going house to house. They killed a couple people on the way, a couple of residents in their homes on the way, hit the high school, took the high school hostage. It was about 400 hostages that they had between students and teachers. By this time, the 70s, Israel had a very robust background and experience in war, in conventional war. We've been attacked from day one, 1948. We got our homeland back after, 3,000 plus years of trying to get it back. And all of a sudden, all of our enemies, all fronts converge. 2 of our elite special ops units, Seret Matkal, which is the unit, that's our equivalent of the Delta unit, responsible for hostage rescue, and Seret Golani, which is a reconnaissance unit for the Northern Command, were tasked with the rescue. And number one, there was no real experience on surgical, micro combat, hostage rescue, counterterror in a selective environment. Number 2, we had 2 different units with 2 different occupations and specialties and experiences that now had to come together in the most sensitive and surgically demanding environment, and it didn't go as planned. It all went sideways. It was a failure as far as operational mission standards are concerned. The terrorists ended up dead, but so did a lot of the hostages, and of course there were casualties on the responder side. And so that is what rang the bell of Israel, and that's where our counterterror mandate was formed. But we realized we need counterterror capabilities, counterterror units. We need a centralized place where all of this expertise and specialty is going to be honed and developed and will evolve, and then will become the hub to be spread around to all of the units that need this this knowledge and skills. In a lot of, if we talk about North America specifically, they still govern themselves by choice, by what they feel they want to do, how they want to do it. They are not really going with the flow of what the threat dictates, what society dictates as far as requirements. So they still operate from that front of the luxury of, tactical guys, spec op guys, officers, whatever you want to call them, operators, units. They're the only ones that need these skills, and everybody else will stay in their kind of respective areas. And you would think that by now, with the magnitude of the active shooter phenomenon pandemic that has hit North America in the last decade, the volume of active shooter attacks, the diversity of the threat types. We've had, obviously, the majority of these active shooting incidents are, we'd categorize them in the EDP or mentally ill category. But North America has absolutely experienced the terror threat in active shooting and active killing attacks. And you would think that by now they would, look at what actually happens in terms of who actually responds, who are the first responders on scene at these events, and do they have what it takes to intervene. The very first incident that occurred in North America, when we say North America, we're talking the US and Canada, of course, and the very first, I think, significant incident that occurred that should have caused a paradigm shift on the responder side was Fort Hood, where you had the DOD female police officer who was first on scene. She intervened. She engaged came into contact with the terrorist, engaged. She got hit quite a few times, but she's the one that put him down. And that right there should have been that bell that rang, the law enforcement community about the facts of who is it that gets there first on scene. It's not SWAT guys. It's not your special operations guys. It's not your tactical guys, right? But they're still reluctant to accept reality from that perspective.
So on that point, it's to both of you. Let's try and word this conceptually. If a tactical team, SWAT team, a special operations team is out there and they're being successful and over, that becomes the correct way of doing things. Then we see our frontline patrol officers that intervene in school shootings and other emergent type situations. And sometimes they're not so successful. And that brings me to the concept of positive and negative 5. And I think this is something that North American law enforcement they can't wrap their heads around this concept. Can either of you comment on how you developed that that idea?
Sorry, Nadav, you want to go ahead?
So this basically brings to what my unit does in general. But the whole idea of active shooters, whoever has a gun needs to get there first. You don't need a SWAT unit to deal with a situation. You first need the shooter to stop shooting hostages or stop shooting civilians. You need him to be distracted by something else, and that's someone else with a gun. It can be the patrol officer, it can be a civilian with a gun, it can be anyone that basically engages the target as quickly as possible. And 99% of the time, that will actually stop the active shooter in his tracks because he's going to be dealing with something else. So that's like a switch in tactics that needs to be done in North America. Because from what I know, I don't know enough about your situations, but even when there are officers on the scene, they tend to be very defensive and not aggressive towards the active shooter. They're waiting for SWAT and other or even backup before they move in. And with our doctrine, that's basically not the right idea. Especially since in North America, active shooters are usually alone. They're on their own. There's just one guy. So you can really focus your attention on him. The unit that I work with, or the unit that I built, is basically built around civilian interaction. The Army takes about between 25 and 45 minutes response time. All the situations where my people are involved, they finish the active shooter within 5 to 7 minutes. From the moment he starts shooting till the moment he's neutralized, it's about 5 minutes. And that's the change in tactics and thinking that sort of gets these things done and minimizes the amount of civilian casualties in these situations.
And we have seen some success in that in the United States with armed citizens intervening in churches.
There was in the church just a couple months
Texas,
ago.
correct.
Yes, and so I think on non-political level, the message is, coming through. But as we get more complicated into different levels of, I guess you said, jurisdiction and government and bureaucracy, we have feet of clay almost in some of these cases and trying to resolve these problems.
Yeah, there has to be a real desire to establish an objective and stay congruent with it. And for us in Israel, we've learned very early on the objective, the most important thing is saving as many lives as possible. That's the bottom line.
So the objective's not officer safety.
No. Is safety important? Safety is important, not from the perspective of we want, our soldiers or police officers or security agents to stay alive, but it's important because if you are injured, you're potentially allowing that threat to continue to kill. So it's important, but our safety doesn't come from protocols or SOPs. It comes from the tactics that we use. That's the difference. It's from the mentality, the aggressive mentality, which, you can look at everything from an empty hand fight to a gunfight to a tactical situation in practically every single case. It is the mindset that dictates who wins. A very, one of the most modern incidents that comes to mind whenever we talk about this subject and when we teach, lethal force engagement to police officers is Dallas. And that particular cell phone footage that was taken from across the street of that poor police officer that ended up being killed because he was hiding behind that pillar while the threat was a pillar away from him.
So we're talking about cover concealment. So what I'm hearing is cover might not save your life.
Cover doesn't save anybody. Whoever it is that is able to flip that off switch on their opponent is the one that stays alive, right? Cover is incidental. Number one, you got to remember that you can't base a methodology or a tactic based on what you might or might not have in the field in that moment. It's kinetically already starts to put you in the negative, starts to put you in reverse instead of forward, and mentally it takes you out of the fight as well. The fact of the matter is that whoever switches on that level of aggression mentally, which translates to physically and tactically first, is the one that stands the most optimal chances of winning. You have to disrupt what that threat is doing. And these threats today, this is what they do. Whether we're talking about terrorists or we're talking about even the mentally ill who mimic and copycat all these terrorists, they know to be aggressive. They know to bring a fight to the officers, and they don't stop.
So bad guy has a better understanding of an engagement than law enforcement is what I'm hearing.
Yes, because
better.
Bad guys are there to fight.
The bad guys have no rules. That's their main. I suppose the main good thing about a bad guy is they have no rules. That they keep them down. They have no tactics or specific doctrines they need to work with, so they can do whatever the hell they want. The way they use cover, the way they move around, sometimes it's actually counter-logical to what's right to do at that moment, but it works because there's no logic to it. So sometimes when you're stuck in your own sort of square of thought, it's hard to engage someone who works completely outside of the box. So sometimes, yes, the bad guys actually understand more how to surprise, be more maneuverable.
Again, this might sound funny. Is there too much thinking on the law enforcement side? Are we putting too much thought into an actual engagement? Are we putting too much thought and having an anticipated outcome based on my training that if I do this, that will happen? And when it doesn't happen, I have to start to backpedal, rethink the situation.
I think the problem actually sometimes even starts with tactics. That the tactics that you're using, you think is supposed to have this certain outcome, but the tactic is actually not working. It never worked in the first place because it was never tested under fire, and then everything sort of just doesn't work for you. This happened to me with Israeli police also that I trained in different situations. They were working with tactics that just don't work.
Right.
So they're in that mindset, and then they don't really know what to do with it. I actually told me the story a couple of days ago. I was doing special forces like competition for the police units, and the lower tier police units came to train for the competition, and I was used as their bad guy. So it was just me against 14 other guys doing paintball, and I took out the entire team on my own. And they're getting all mad and everything, and they're saying that I'm not engaging according to the rules of engagement, and I'm lying and whatever. And I said everything is filmed. We can check this out in the briefing room. And I told them, okay, you don't believe me? Let's do that again. And again, 14 guys against me. I take them all out. Now, all I'm doing is standing behind cover properly and engaging them very, very calmly. They're using very aggressive tactics, but they're using one-man tactics. They're not using their team tactics, because police
Dynamic entry is what they're doing.
What?
They're doing dynamic entries.
Yeah, they're doing dynamic entries, and they're working basically on their own. They're not working as a team. They're not using their better firepower against me, and I'm basically taking them out one by one, just in the funnel. And you can see it on camera. I'm not moving a centimeter. All you can see is my weapon going a little bit up and down, and that's about it.
Okay, so let's talk about the funnel. You brought it up. It's a huge controversial word here. Again, in law enforcement and training, the military, the fatal funnel. Is it two points of cover, or is it a funnel? Do I have to go through there?
It depends on your mission objective and the equipment that you have. Israelis in the early 2000s understood that you actually don't have to go through the door. You can just blow up a new hole in the wall. But that's when you're dealing with bigger conflict. The units that I train don't have that kind of equipment. They have to go through the door. But they have to do it with significantly more firepower, or a bit more understanding and use of cover. Even if the cover itself doesn't stop bullets, sometimes just having a smaller profile and being able to see the target better before you enter that room is actually quite a good indicator, or a good tactic to use. Just breaking in through those doors when the room is darker and it's just harder to see, it doesn't always work.
Clearly.
Let's you know what, since we already got to this subject, let's define a couple things here so that people also understand the reasons behind why everybody does what they do. So we're talking about the fatal funnel, which a fatal funnel either 100% exists or 100% does not exist. It's all in the hands of the beholder. It's just like a gun. It all depends on who is turning that threshold into a fatal funnel. And the problem is that I got to caveat something here, right? So I make a lot of references to Israel versus America, okay? And I don't do that as a kind of a demeaning or belittling thing. I don't do it as a one better than the other. I do it as those are the only two places that do things differently. When I say America, I generally mean the United States, because they really lead the world in what is done. Everybody does what they do. They're leaders when it comes to that. In Israel, we do things vastly different as far as our tactics. So we, as many people know, we fight in terms of Israelis from the threshold, from the doorway. Whereas the rest of the world does the dynamic entry method. And the leading principle behind this dynamic entry method is this notion that the threshold is a fatal funnel, that if you are in that threshold, you're a bullet magnet. So let's dissect that for a sec. Number one, well, before I get to that, how did we get to the point in Israel that we came up with this fighting from the opening is what the translation is. In North America, it's been termed limited penetration, LIMPEN. Okay, so I'll refer to it as that because most viewers will probably be familiar with that term. When we got hit in 1974 with that hostage situation, and we started developing our counter-terror mandates and tactics. By the time we got into the early 80s, This was the mandate of all of our enemies, all the terror groups. It was to attack civilians. It was to attack on the civilian front of Israel, surgical combat, active shooters, and hostage situations. And we didn't have, again, a lot of experience with that. So our unit that was in charge of that whole subject, Unit 767 Matkal, our Delta Force equivalent, went to the U.S. Delta Force to go learn what it is that they are doing as far as entry tactics. And entries really are the bread and butter of everything related to counterterror warfare. It is what you do. These attacks hit in civilian occupied structures, and we have to go in, whether it's an intervention, whether it's a takeover. And at that time, and the British SAS and the US Delta, they were doing the same thing. It was the same tactic that everybody was using, that they had created, which was to dominate the room from a 360-degree environment. Number 1 and 2 enter, take the hard corners, go to the far corners. 3 and 4 right away take the hard corners, and now you've got all 4 corners dominated, and you've got a 360-degree dominance of that room. In theory, it makes complete sense. So our unit took that, and that's what we started doing in Israel in the 80s. It worked 100% of the time when there were no threats in the room that were shooting at the operators coming into the room. Our dynamic in Israel is vastly different in that the paradigm for us, the standard for us, is that especially in the era of the 80s, the 90s, and going into at least the first decade of 2000s, which entries were the number one thing that we were all doing. If we hit a door and that building doesn't blow up, or we don't have a refrigerator, a stove, or a bed shooting at you, something is wrong. That was the norm. Very, very quickly, we learned that as a human, doesn't matter what uniform you're wearing, what equipment you have, what training you have, and what your mandate is. As a human, when you are stepping into a threshold and there is rounds coming at you, and the reality is that 99% of all the real life environments where these rounds will be coming at you, they do not resemble anything like they do in training. It's not a flat range, which you have 4 walls and a ceiling and light, and that's it. It is a cluster of a room. When I say a fridge shooting at you, that's not a joke. These terrorists devised tactics such as they would empty out their fridge. They would have holes drilled into their fridge, 2 holes, one for the muzzle of an AK-47, the other one for their eye, and they would sit there, crouch down in their fridge, and as soon as our responders would go in, they would open up. It takes you a long time to figure out where these rounds are coming from. When these rounds are coming at you, let's forget for a second the fact that there's a delay in being able to process and identify, which already puts you into a state of shock, into a state of stress, into a state of panic, and you freeze. But even if none of that is there, it's a very scary situation. And it alters the DNA of how you think and how you move and what you do. We realize there's no such thing as anybody entering and taking any corners. It doesn't work. The moment that you've got a threat who is shooting at you. When I say threat in the room, we have to define that as well, because it doesn't matter if your threat is just standing there holding a gun. Doesn't matter if your threat is, standing there staring at the doorway with that gun in their hand. The defining catalyst is when you appear in that threshold and that threat is unloading rounds at you. Real bullets flying at you, not simunition bullets. Those have nothing to do. They don't replicate real life. So our tactic changed. We said, okay, it's not humanly possible to take 4 corners. Let's just take 2 corners. 1 and 2 will enter the room and they will take the 2 close corners. 3 and 4 will just fill in. Even that never happened. The point is that the second that you reach that threshold and rounds are flying at you, every human sucks back. You go back to your natural, point of cover, of feeling safe. And a lot of it has to do as well with the delay in being able to recognize where the rounds are coming from, how many threats you have. So the ability to actually respond tactically. And so they stand on the door, and from there is where they engage. So we said, okay, scrap all this entry. We're going to fight from the doorway. Our tactic became fighting from the doorway. And all of a sudden, we had a tremendous amount of success. We had the ability to identify the threat before the threat can fire. We had the ability to, even under fire, as rounds are coming in, still remain calm and control the situation. Our levels, rates of casualty drastically dropped. So that is the main core of our fighting methodology when it comes to to enclosures, to structures. And that right away sets off this cascading effect of all of these other benefits that come into play on a scientific level, a physiological level, on so many other levels. The fatal funnel.
I want to add here something, Neil, just before you move on, is that the combat with the room is done from the threshold. When we're entering that room, we're actually moving to the next room. Dealing with that specific room is basically done before we have even entered, hopefully. Sometimes we do have to still clear a corner or clear something else, but once we're in a room, we're actually maneuvering to the next threshold to fight from there. Not so much fight from inside the room, especially when you're talking about real close quarters buildings, like small rooms, bedrooms, stuff like that. Not talking about like big halls and stuff and whatever. So yeah, you can continue.
Yeah, 100%. Right. So just quickly going to close the loop on that concept of the fatal funnel, because as I know, Nadav, you would get hit with this a lot. So Nadav, again, he commanded our International Joint Forces training section. We had all the U.S. Spec Op units and other world units that would be sent to us for specialized training before they deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan, essentially to learn our methodologies of how it is that we have been coexisting with these threats for, at that time, about 60 years. That the world was now going into the hornet's nest. They were all going into their backyard to take them on with their tactics in their territory. And I know, because I would get asked this question tons of time when I would work with all these units, MARSOC, Green Berets, Delta, you name it, all the units around the world. When we would show them our tactics, right away, their biggest concern is, well, what about the fatal funnel? And that question of the fatal funnel can be so easily answered when we do some force on force stuff, right? It doesn't replicate reality, but the concept they learn right away. When you are passively running in through a room, which the concept is to rush through that doorway so you're out of the fatal funnel, well, guess what? When you appear in that threshold and then you remove yourself from that threshold, those bullets are still following you. The bad guy isn't stuck on that doorway sending rounds into that doorway. So the faster you go into the room, the more of an effective spaghetti strainer you're going to look like. Conversely, when we post up on that threshold, we have different ways that we do things depending on what the mission profile is. When we dominate, we are putting the bad guy in the fatal funnel. The bad guy now is in a 360-degree fatal funnel. That entire room, doesn't matter where it is that he is running to, where he's hiding behind, we can easily dominate and control. So there's that mental shift that that has to come into play. And like Nadav was saying, for us, we don't want to go into rooms until we know that they're safe to go into. So the hallway is the most dangerous place that you can be in because of the virtue of the fact that you have all these multiple openings, right? And you don't really have anywhere that you can move to for safe cover. We work on clearing that room as quickly as we can from the outside. Quickly, I say that with, a little bit of a caveat there. But then once we move in, that becomes our safe zone. And then we immediately move from room to room to room. The North American method, if we're talking about, about clearing, so let's just quickly define a couple things here, right? Situations that we have hostage rescue, we have intervention, which would be like an active shooter type of a scenario. And then we have high risk entries, okay? Whether that's warrant execution, whether that's going into arrest, going into raid, to search, whatever the case is. In Israel, we have a different method for each one, but all of it revolves around the threshold. What varies is the speed and the angles that we work with. In hostage rescue, we do it just past the threshold. There's a way in which we can enter and cover all angles at once. In a high risk entry, we call it a secure search. A high risk entry, it's a 4-man dynamic that we have, 4 operator dynamic that we have that moves in, and we never move past a foot at a time. We conquer space by space by space. We never spread out and run the risk of all of a sudden having multiple engagements in different areas, which turns everything upside down. Bullets flying through walls, hitting operators. There's no communication. It's just a big cluster of a mess. So it's very methodical.
I want to add here something that Jimmy sort of talked about earlier is the civilian more important or the operator more important? So again, the tactics are built around what is the mission specific objective? Because if I'm here to arrest someone, my number one priority is actually getting my men out alive. I don't care if I need to leave the building and drop the building on him because I want to protect my men. Then the tactic will be slower, more systematic. If I'm dealing with hostage rescue or with an active shooter, then the speed of the tactics sort of increase, and the protection for my soldier gets lower and lower. But the techniques are very, very similar, but it's a matter of a scale of speed and how much I want to defend my soldier. Because if you're talking about the secure technique, we can clear a house. We can take the entire day to clear the house if we really want to. If you want to be very methodical, very protective. But if it's hostage rescue, we'll clear the house in less than a minute if we need to.
1,000%. And that actually is the defining factor is there civilians or are there no civilians? That's what begins everything. And then from there, that'll go on to the speed that we work with. And I know, Jimmy, you got obviously tons of experience with this being in police special operations here in Canada for as long as you have. When you plan out, let's just say a high risk entry, right? A warrant execution, an arrest warrant or whatever the case is. And you've got, in the case of bigger teams, you might have a team of, let's say, 20 operators that'll go and make the entry. And you might have a standard type of a structure that, doesn't have as many rooms as a hotel or an office place or a school or what have you. And so when you plan it out, it's very easy to say, you two are going to this room, you two in that room, you two in that room. And on paper, it all looks perfect and everything is covered. Not once does that ever play out that way. Not once does it ever play out that way, because you got the first two that go into that one room, and that room has another room or has a responsibility. You've got unknowns. You've got a threat. You got now at least one operator that's got to stay there and now cover the threat, the unknowns. The other one has to go into the next room. Before you know it, you don't have enough people cycling from room to room to room. And so you're now doing things that completely contradict SOPs and tactics. You have to have single officers going into rooms when there's no tactics for that here, right? And it just doesn't play out that way. Now you're all spread out. It takes longer to clear it, but it's also disorganized. So for us, it's a 4-man element that we have, and we will always have the exact same element covering the entire structure, no matter how many rooms, because we never deviate from that. It's one increment at a time, one angle at a time, one room at a time.
So you control the environment. Environment doesn't control you.
Beautifully said. 100%. 100%. Yeah. So then, when you start to add to that, if you now complicate the environment, such as multiple threats inside the room, the more you deplete your resources in a fashion that is not planned for and not prepared for as far as tactics and SOPs, that's when the danger happens. That is where you now have some serious issues, because now people are starting to rush. They're starting to run down hallways to go and get into a room where they may have heard gunfire without knowing what happened, who fired, why did they fire, where it came from. That's where you start to get your blue on blue scenarios, and you start to get, just a big chaotic situation that goes on. Conversely, even if it's one operator in an intervention type of an environment, you can have one operator who has full control of the environment by virtue of dissecting that room accordingly, right? From the threshold, when we're talking about the actual micro aspect of the room. So that's on that topic, kind of that's where our tactics were developed from, and we use them across the board for everything that we do, right? But they have variations. Everything is from the threshold, though. Unlike the North American method, which is hostage rescue, dynamic entry, intervention, dynamic entry, barricaded subject, dynamic entry, high risk warrant, dynamic entry, right? And it doesn't make sense because those are all vastly different profiles. They're vastly different situations. They bring about vastly different elements. How is it that you have one method that can address all that? That just doesn't really make that much sense. You got to cater everything to the mission profile, just like Nadav said. And the unique elements that profile, that scenario, contributes to the equation, and work based on that.
Can I go back to +5, -5?
Yes. Let me quickly define that, because even in Israel, the concept, everybody does it. How many people actually, like everywhere in this line of work, Many people know to do the thing, but they don't understand why they're doing the thing or how they're doing the thing, right? So it's kind of like I remember once I was sitting with a Canadian tactical guy, very, very experienced guy, and he asks me, so Nir, do you know the Israeli peak? I'm like, what's the Israeli peak? And, he goes, you know the Israeli peak? I'm talking to this Israeli special forces guy here who doesn't know the Israeli peak. I'm like, what I understand. What's the Israeli peak? And so, it's where you're staying on the corner and you're kind of peeking out the corner with your weapon that way. I go, it's like fighting from the threshold, right? This guy was Spanish. And I said to him, when you go to a Spanish restaurant, do you order a Spanish paella or do you just ask for a paella, right? We don't define things in Israel as Israeli this, Israeli that, right? So -5, +5, real quick. This is a scale that was taught to me early 2000s when I was involved in intervention stuff that Nadav does, and I had a lot of training from guys who were in the Shabak, or internal security security service. And here's kind of what defines also terrorism and terror attacks. The -5, +5 is a scale that depicts either the responder or the threat's disposition to respond to an attack in that moment in time. And it depicts the 3 elements: your physical disposition, meaning your body positioning. If you're ready for a fight, your body is in position to fight. Your tactical disposition, whatever your tools are. If it's your fist and your fists are up, they're ready to go. If it's your gun is out of its holster, it's ready to go. And then most importantly, your mental disposition. You know that you're about to get into a fight. So your whole world now revolves around that. Conversely, the -5 is where physically, tactically, mentally, you have no clue that you're about to get attacked. So your body position.
That would be police, law enforcement ambush.
A police, law enforcement
car, having a coffee,
100%.
hero coffee, and then that person's attacked and they have to recover.
100%, right? So the way that I define it when I teach here in North America, you got a police officer, right, that pulls over a vehicle, runs the plates, and information comes back. This car was involved in an armed robbery. Suspect is wanted, considered armed and dangerous. Approach with caution. This officer has nothing that exists in their whole being, mentally, emotionally, physically, than survival right now. Immediately, they get out, weapon comes out, they've got their sight alignment, sight picture, they're squared away on everything that they need to do. They, order the subject to get out of the car, whatever the case is. Subject jumps out of the car with a gun. The officer fires 1 shot, hits him, done. 100% hit ratio average. Everything worked out great. That's not important to us because in those situations, if you're a professional and you've honed your skills, you're going to win. The problem is that same scenario, a police officer pulls over this vehicle, runs the plates, no information comes back. The officer doesn't know that this car was involved in an armed robbery, killed somebody, driver is armed and dangerous and wanted. Officer walks up to the car, and in the officer's mind right now, they've got this whole environment of trying to investigate. Asking questions, trying to look into the car to see what they can pick up, using their investigative skills here. What's your name and where you coming from? And, your brake light was out. That's why I pulled you over. So what's the story with that? Right? Do you have identification on you? It's all stuff that don't relate to combat. Meanwhile, the subject knows this officer is about to identify who I am, that I'm wanted for murder, and they're going to arrest me and I'm not going to get arrested. And look at that. The officer is standing there 2 feet from me. His or her head is down looking at my ID. Nobody's around. I can punch him in the face, draw my gun, shoot them, get out of here. Nobody will know. And that's what they do. Out of nowhere, the officer suddenly gets hit. Rounds are flying at them. And if they're lucky enough, they draw their weapon and they start to unload. And this is where we see the hit ratio averages of under 19% here in North America. 1 out of every 5 rounds a police officer fires in a gunfight, especially in those types of predicaments, 1 out of every 5 rounds actually hits the target. 4 go astray. So that is the -5. Why is that important to us? And our methodologies are all based on this, because that's what terrorists do. Terrorists, they have a job. Their job is to succeed. It's to succeed with their mission. And when they hit, they know what's going to happen. They know where to hit, when to hit. They know how to hit in a way that is going to allow them to have enough time before they're taken out to maximize damage. They know who the security person is, that they're armed, and how to ambush them and get them out of the equation so they can go after the civilians. So the majority of all these terrorist attacks that we face, even till today, we're in the -5. We're not prepared in that moment, and you have to react. Your reactionary tactical skills are what are going to dictate and dominate. So it doesn't matter what your cognitive tactical skills are. You're never going to be walking around in the low ready, ready to just bring your dot, your reflex dot onto a strike, onto the threat. Doesn't happen that way. And so that's where our methodologies are based on. And it all begins with mental training, whether it's Krav Maga, empty-handed, whether it's shooting, whether it's tactics.
What I'm hearing is principles.
It's all principles.
I'm not hearing techniques. I'm hearing principles.
The
principles go
we call it in Hebrew, we call it flipping the bowl, I suppose.
Okay.
It's flipping of your mental state within a moment from basically passiveness to aggressiveness.
Right.
So it's how I am now on my Saturday morning prayers, and suddenly the synagogue gets hit, and how I just throw everything away and deal with the threat immediately and basically take out that first bullet, that first round as quickly as possible. Most of my work is with civilians, and I would say that about 60-70% of what I work with them is how to take out that first bullet as quickly as possible, how to engage their target as quickly as possible, also mentally, not just technically.
Well, Major, let me ask you this. What could you share in terms of planning for senior officers? Getting ready for a mission, getting ready, making that operational plan. How do you download that to your personnel so make sure that they all understand what we need to do today, and how does that work in Israel?
Okay, so first of all, what I do today is I deal with situations that are almost completely a surprise. So we actually have no planning in 95% of the operations that many people are involved in. But when I dealt more with counterterrorism units and with that kind of stuff, the first thing is simplicity of planning. People tend to overplan and sort of make these elaborate plans. They never work out. You sort of need to have like the basics of what the room entry is, who's first, who's second, who's third, and sort of have very dynamic thinking when you're working on the fly, sort of. My father was also in the military. He was an officer, and he was involved in one of the biggest operations in 1967. It's taught in West Point. He was operations officer, and he talked to me a lot about how they would do mission planning. Basically, what's the rundown of bringing up the idea, doing like a sandbox training on that, and then leaving enough time to do models. I don't know what it's called in English, but basically repetition of
models.
Yep.
Models. Okay. What I find with junior officers mostly is that they spend 90% of their time planning, maybe 10% of the time actually debriefing their soldiers on what they want them to do, and it leaves them no time to actually do modeling. So it's like, leave your plan very simple, leave the planning to like 10%, 50% of your time, get input from your second in command, get input from your squad team, bring down that plan and do models, because when you're doing modeling, you can see where your plan is going to fail. And if you waste your time on planning and not doing the modeling part, you basically don't have the option to see where you're wrong and what doesn't work.
I think that's great advice, because we all speak and listen on different frequencies. So I can ask an individual to do something, and they say, yes, I understand. But when actually physically watching, no, that wasn't what I was talking about.
They do the complete opposite of what you asked them.
Right. I think that's really good advice.
That's, it's interesting you bring that up, and I'm just kind of going through my head my service in the unit, and there's this contrast right now in two predicaments that ties all this in, and that you just clarified for me as well, that I never really thought about. But we have two dynamics on the operational side of our unit, the counterterror unit. One of them is we are 24/7 a response unit. So we have teams that cycle around 24/7 that are on standby in case there's a terror attack anywhere in Israel. We're one of the main responders for it. We have the vans, the equipment is there. When your team is assigned, you guys, you go through the gamut of preparing all your individual equipment, then all the team equipment, and nothing moves. You have the tactics and the SOPs in your mind. You know exactly what needs to be done. If all of a sudden you're activated, everybody drops everything, you run to the vans, off you go, right? There's no time for planning. There's really not much of a necessity for it. The second nature on the operational side is direct action missions that we do. A lot of arrests, a lot of entries. And when we would get notified that we have a mission coming up, generally the majority of all of our missions would be at nighttime, and we would get the notification throughout the day. And the moment that you get that notification, you have hours that's spent now contributing to the preparation. Everybody gets notified. You go to the bunker. You get all of your equipment prepared. You start preparing the different tasking equipment for the team as a whole. You get together for your first debrief. The commander gives us an overview of what's going on. Here's the team assignments. Get into your teams and start preparing. So I was a TL on our the actual entry team. So my job right away was to take all of my guys, and we would go find a doorway, and we would start practicing. Whenever we would have models to work off of, we would draw them out, lay them out. Everybody would get together. We'd start working. And this is a day-long process. By the time night falls, 11 o'clock, midnight, we load onto the APCs, and we go off to the FOB that we're going to be working out from. And so that is all based on not just the planning, but just like Nadav said as well, the most important thing is that everybody has to live as much as they can, as close as possible to reality, what you're actually going to be doing when you're in that field on a macro level, whether you're part of the containment team, the approach to the containment, to then when we enter, what we do and how we do. We go over contingencies. We sit there and we start throwing contingencies at each other. What do we do if this happens and if that happens, right? So that planning is absolutely crucial. It's an interesting kind of contradiction, if you will, with what we have with those two operational dynamics that we would be responsible for with our unit.
So I would actually also say that let me explain a bit about my unit and what we're actually doing, and then I can sort of go into other stuff. So the School for Settlement Protection is in charge of training civilians in 450 towns and villages across the country. Every town that has a border with a potential enemy has civilian volunteers that are armed by the military, and in case somebody decides to do a terrorist attack in their city or town or settlement or whatever, these civilians jump from their house, they put on their vest, they take their weapon, and they run towards the target. So as I said earlier, our response time is usually less than 5 minutes. From the moment we have an active shooter, a person leaves his house, takes his weapon, runs, kills the target. So when we're starting out, basically you're watching TV and you get the phone call, or you hear outside your door that there's an active shooter. So you take your gun, you run out, and who do you see outside? You see a couple of guys with guns. Most of them are not the terrorist. And you sort of, while you're running towards the active shooter, you're sort of building up your team. Now, depending on the hour of the active shooter, sometimes it will be just one person responding. Sometimes it will be 12 people responding. And then we sort of build together as people sort of join in. You sort of start building a plan. But the basic idea is reach the active shooter, engage him as quickly as possible, sort of quarantine the area of where he's fighting, and close in on him as quickly as possible. And I was talking earlier about simplicity. So it's always keeping things as simple as possible. You need your orders to be precise. You need everything to be dynamic and quick. And you need to be talking the same language with everyone else in that fighting team. So you can breach. Like if I see a terrorist going into a house, I'm not going to wait for a breaching team. I'm going to run after him into that house. If I have a number 2 or number 3, it's their job to join me and sort of work with those with the tactics that we're using. But the number 1 soldier doesn't actually know. The number 1 operator doesn't actually know if he has someone else with him. So that's like another sort of interesting aspect of not really planning, but understanding how to work together on the fly, which only works with a lot of training. and keeping the rules of combat and tactics simple. Nothing too fancy. Just do what you need to do.
Nadav, give a little bit of this is really important so that people understand, though, because we're talking about active shooter intervention, but the dynamic of what we face in Israel and what your unit is responsible for is actually quite different. We aren't talking for us in Israel. The paradigm isn't a terrorist that necessarily goes into a structure and it's all contained. And, you know, as responders, that's one of the greatest benefits you can have is when everything is contained to a specific structure. We're talking about entire towns where these terrorists infiltrate, generally in small teams, 2 pairs or 3s. And you have to now deal with an entire geographical jurisdiction that's got structures, homes, community centers, you name it in there. And you got to work with this open environment dynamic, which generally leads into a closed environment dynamic when you finally are able to identify where the terrorist is, if they're inside a structure. Talk a little bit about that, as well as before your unit was established to really solidify this art craft of intervention, the response came at the hands of the IDF and the border police. Yeah. And the times, right, that these attacks would last for, in addition to the response time, were vastly different than what goes on today. Talk a little bit about that, please.
Okay, so as I said, during the 70s and 80s, we're talking mostly about hostage rescue. Eventually, the terrorists understood that hostage situations were not really getting what they wanted to get. And they moved into more classical terrorism, which is basically infiltrating towns and killing as many civilians as possible, generally speaking, without any plan to get out. They knew that they were going in to commit suicide. They're going in, they're going to kill as many Jews as possible, and they're going to die. They have generally no plan of escape. And what would happen was these civilian teams that I train now, they did exist in a manner of speaking, but they have no jurisdiction of intervention. Basically, if a terrorist was going in, they would try to sort of quarter off a place, but they wouldn't engage because the training was very, very low. And that was the concept at the time. You wait for a special forces unit to deal with hostage rescue because everything was focused around hostage rescue. But as there were more and more infiltrations into these towns, what would happen is that the terrorists would move from house to house. You would kill families, you would kill people. People wouldn't engage the target. And the average response time of the military, if it was just like a local unit, it would take like 25 minutes to arrive. And if it's a special forces unit, that could sometimes even take an hour, depending on how far the nearest intervention team is. And even then, a lot of these intervention teams were mostly infantry or reconnaissance units that were focused mostly on infantry tactics. So even if they would go into the houses, they would still think more in an enemy territory kind of thing. And they'd end up also hitting civilians. So what basically happened was the government decided to start arming civilians and training them a bit better. And essentially, the concept was that these guys are going to be our first responders. These are going to be the first people on the area. They live in the town. They understand the dynamics of the town. They know the structure of the town. Basically, all the ideas of defense, of knowing your territory, belongs to the people who actually live there. Even if a special forces unit arrives on scene, they have no idea where the synagogue is, where the kindergarten is, where the houses are. It's like a completely new environment for them, and they have to sort of deal with it. And again, as he said, the fighting wouldn't happen that much in the house. That would actually happen more in the street. Sometimes they'd hit a specific house, move to the next house, and move to the next house. So everything was sort of very dynamic. And we understood that the faster we are able to engage the target and keep him occupied with us and not with civilians, the easier it would be to basically finish the situation. And the times, if we're talking early 2000s, interventions were an hour and a half long until the threat was neutralized, and probably hours until we basically finish searching the town. We brought it down to 5 minutes. Today, almost every single intervention that happens is done within 5 minutes from the moment the shooter is identified or the actual killing spree starts. When 20 years ago, it would take us 15, 20, 25, 30 minutes just to find the target and engage him in the beginning. So I think that answers your question, unless I'm missing something.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. It's interesting that some of the things that would also contribute to that time factor. There were times where you would have a terrorist that would infiltrate a town armed with an AK-47 and grenades, and if you pull on scene, or if you are part of the settlement QRF, you have the benefit of that indicator being able to find the terrorist, because of the gunfire, the explosions. But we've had a lot of situations where they would infiltrate, 2, 3 of them with knives and go house to house, killing family members with knives, and you've got no audio indicators to go off, right? We had the very tragic and unfortunate incident in 2011 in Itamar, the Fogel family, a group of 3 terrorists infiltrated the home. They broke in. It was the middle of the night. They killed the parents and 3 kids, including an infant baby sleeping in its crib, and nobody heard a thing, right? So there's a lot of importance on having a very concise macro level SOP of how you enter, how you approach, how you start to search, as well as a tactical approach to it, because you've got no time to deal with here, and you're talking about a vast area that you need to work with now to stop killing. And I think actually one of the interesting things, I don't think you hit on it, Nadav, but we're talking here, intervention is one of the most complicated applications that we have. It requires a tremendous amount of proficiency, optimal capability, tactics. It requires everything on the list of what you need as far as an operator to contend with that level of dynamic violence. And the irony is that a large part of the operators that fall under your command on these response teams, many of them served in the IDF and happen to live in those towns, and many of them served in special units. And generally, just culturally, the way that it works is when you have a lot of like neighborhoods and settlements where people in there gravitate towards a certain caliber of service. You'll have a lot of officers, you'll have, households with members who are vets of our special units, and they all kind of tend to live in the same communities. But you also have the complete polar opposite. You've got settlements where the residents don't serve in the IDF at all for various exemptions. You've got members of your unit who don't have a previous background, and you don't get the luxury of spending 22 months of training them from basic right up to advanced capabilities. Right? Talk a little bit about that, the recruitment.
Okay, so
and the qualification process.
So basically, we have different commands. We have Northern Command, Central Command, Southern Command. Each one has a very different set of threats, but the composure of these towns is quite similar. Generally speaking, we're talking about towns that have about 150 to 1,000 families. Some of these towns will have a large number of ex-IDF. Some of them may be an ultra-Orthodox community, which none of them served in the military. And you need them to volunteer. These are people who have work. They have their regular lives. These are not active service people. They receive their rifle and their vest from the military, and then they get their training. What is their training? A beginner, someone who just enters the team, will have about 3 days of intensive training. And then, generally speaking, they have another extra 2 days of training a year. Now, in towns that are much more threatened and have had multiple instances, they, generally speaking, have more training. They sometimes raise money to get people to instruct them. And some of these teams work about once a month. They have 2 days of training. These guys have been training for 20 years, 2 days a month. These guys are high-level operators. On the other hand, if you're a town that has never been hit, you're relatively far away from the threat, you're going to have 3 or 4 days of training a year if you're lucky. And you're still going to get hit eventually, because the terrorists constantly change their way of thinking and their way of attacking, and they understand that it's difficult to continue to fight where we're strong. So you're going to look for the weak links, and that's when they start hitting these weaker towns, and then they beg for more training and they want to do more. So each command sort of has a different style of training, but basically they have between 3 days on average to maybe 20 or 30 days a year, training for not only intervention, but also the secure technique. We have these different modes of fighting when we're working in these towns. You have the active shooter, but you also have to work when there's no active shooter. Let's say we've neutralized the target. There's nothing that's bringing us to a target.
No indicators.
What?
No indicators.
Yeah, no indicators. Then we're moving into a more secure technique. So that needs another type of training. And we're sort of basically teaching all these different special forces techniques within 2 or 3 days. And we expect them to be able to handle it. And most cases, they do it wonderfully. I think one of the reasons is because of the way that we doctrine our instruction. We try to not waste time on anything useless. We try to bring down to I keep on saying this, basics.
I have to ask, such as, what would you define as useless?
It's basically talking too much. People in training tend to fight about techniques and stuff like that. It's like exactly. And we streamline our training. I come originally from an infantry unit. When we would do shooting ranges, we were lucky if we did 3 or 4 shooting ranges a day. There's like tons of hours of wasted time with bureaucracy. When I'm training if as an infantry unit during the day, I could shoot maybe, 50, 60 rounds of ammunition. In 1 day training, I expect to shoot at least 400 rounds of ammunition with my people, with their specific tactics and what they need to do, sometimes more, sometimes less, but it's basically not wasting time and using just the techniques that they really need to use. And if I have more time, then I'll go into more elaborate stuff, but I try to keep it to the basics. First of all, I want you to attack the target. I want you to be aggressive. I want you to shoot the first bullet as quickly as possible and as precisely as possible without hitting civilians around you. That's our priority. If we have more time, then we'll add you some cover. We'll add you some better tactics. And if I have more time, then we'll go into more complex scenarios. But basically, that's what we're focusing on: how to reach our target as quickly as possible, as effectively as possible.
I see.
Very nice. We spent a lot of time talking about the combat aspect, the tactical aspect, all the things that we do. And that carries with it quite a burden, as we know. I think the 3 of us sitting here we've walked the path of the aftermath of what we do and what we have seen in our respective service journey, specifically with PTSD. I know all 3 of us have stories that we can share, but I know Nadav, we spoke quite a bit as well, and you yourself, in addition to all the combat aspect of your life and your profession, you're also into the healing aspect, the polar opposite end of the spectrum, and specifically with your own journey with PTSD and how you help not just prepare our warriors in Israel to confront terrorism, but to also survive the aftermath that a lot of our fellow brothers and sisters are contending with all around the world in this line of work. Why don't we talk a little bit about that? You have a book. You have an interesting book from Gaza to Buddha. I love the title. Give us a little bit.
Actually, that's not a book yet. I'm writing that book. It's a lecture that I run with. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I misunderstood, but please share with us a little bit about that topic and your involvement in the world of PTSD and survival and recovery from that.
Yeah. So for me, it took me a long time to understand that I was post-traumatic. It began with combat as an infantry soldier in Gaza. And I basically, if we're talking, let's first explain what post-traumatic stress is. It has all these different dynamics to it, and it really depends on each person how they react to it. But for me, it was extreme hypervigilance. My nervous system was constantly working. I was on guard all the time, and eventually, just being so hyped led me into depression and eventually even to suicidal thoughts. And all of this while I'm an active duty officer. So I'm doing my job, but in my mind, things are happening. I lost my ability to sleep. Every single sound sort of triggered me. And you have to sort of focus through that. And eventually, what I did when I decided to leave the military, I spent about a year traveling the Far East in monasteries. I was studying philosophy, meditation, that kind of stuff to sort of deal with it. And actually, only when I was there, I understood that I was suffering from post-traumatic stress. During a session of meditation, suddenly all this combat just came flooding in. And that was like, okay, I understand what's going on now, and I can actually start dealing with it. Which brought me into the world of acupuncture, Chinese medicine, meditation, all that kind of stuff. And the basic idea is that post-traumatic stress sits on your nervous system in a very, very strong way, and you need to find a way to calm down that nervous system. If it's breathing techniques, if it's physical work, it can even be martial arts. It's all these ways to sort of disperse that extra energy, but also rewire your mind, because the problem with post-traumatic stress is that there's something with your memory that's not working properly. Your prefrontal cortex sort of observes the world, and it's supposed to store the stuff in your memory. But when you're in stress or in a stressful situation, something there just doesn't work, and the memory doesn't get stored properly. And that works on your nervous system. And so for a lot of people, it's the nightmares. It's suddenly being back in the situation. Somebody just slams the door really, really strong, and suddenly you're back in Gaza or Fallujah or wherever that engagement was. So I spent a lot of time working on myself and how to calm down that system, and acupuncture really helped for me. So I sort of went into that field, and I specialized also in post-traumatic stress. I joined a group that's called Acupuncturists Without Borders. It deals with post-traumatic stress around the world, not just from combat, but from other stuff. But I use those techniques. With the people that I use, I focus mostly on military personnel. And it's basically, again, through acupuncture, through breathing techniques, and through changing philosophically the way you have your outlook on life. That sort of helped me get through or manage my post-traumatic stress. I don't think you can ever really get completely clean from it, but you can manage it. Yeah, I think that's so. Gaza, from Gaza to Buddha is basically my story, from my combat in Gaza to my time in the Far East studying all these philosophies. It's not that I'm a Buddhist, but Buddhist way of thinking allowed me to observe the world in a more objective way. A lot of stuff that veterans have a problem with is sort of getting into day-to-day life. It's like everything is a combat situation for them. Understanding what's going on, the way people interact with you, you become very, very angry. And it's the Buddhist part of the thinking sort of helps you objectively look at life. and sort of bring things more into proportion. And from there, you can sort of regain your control on your own mind and the way that you think and the way that you react. We didn't talk about this so much on the tactical level, but Israel is very, very focused on aggression training, which I don't like that much anymore. I like the more Zen aspect of combat, of going into combat with a clear and calm mind, which is something that I brought in for myself from the East, and that's sort of what also helped me later on in other combat, not get into like deeper traumatic stress. Yeah.
Interesting. Your dynamic in your unit today, the majority of all the operators that you oversee, they're former IDF vets who now are civilian citizens living in these towns and who, you know, take on this added responsibility of picking up a gun to defend their communities. Do you come across a lot of PTSD in that circle?
Yeah, a lot of them. Again, especially in the towns that have been hit, these are really close-knit communities. So when your neighbor gets hit, or your your family member or whatever, it's like it's not just the people who have to lift their gun, it's every single person in the community. There's one town that got hit within like 3 months. They got hit like 3 or 4 times by terrorists from different aspects. And eventually I actually came there with Acupuncturists Without Borders to treat the civilians, the entire town, not just the people who
Wow.
were engaged in combat, because the whole town was actually suffering from a form of post-traumatic stress as a community, and we wanted to treat them as a community. But again, if I'm talking about these operators, in the end, you have your wife and you have your kids and you're sitting at home, and suddenly you get the phone call or you hear the shooting outside your house, and you now have to make a conscious decision to take your gun and leave your family behind and go into combat when your family is just as much in a threat than everyone else. So there's also a whole psychological level of how we train our people to basically go and do that. But again, Israel is a post-traumatic stress state. I mean, basically everyone has some level of post-trauma, if it's from being hit from rockets or terrorist attacks or suicide bombers in buses, and constant war. Some more than others, but yeah, I mean, that's just the reality of what we're living with.
Our motto has always been in Israel that Israel is a country that's in a constant state of conflict, interrupted by moments of war. 100%. And it's true, because that actually it affects people from 2 dynamics, right? Number one is that almost every single Israeli citizen somehow is connected to the IDF. You either are going to serve, you have served, you are serving, your parents served, your grandparents served, your kids are serving, right? There's that connection that's just intrinsically there, given the fact that it's a mandatory service state. And if you're not serving and you don't have anything to do with the IDF actively, you're still sitting in this tiny little landmass that is under attack from all fronts, whether it's Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, terrorists that are coming into the towns, targeting civilians, or whether it's the thousands of rockets being launched in from Gaza all over Israel. So it's very hard to escape that paradigm in Israel, no matter what you're doing.
And I'd also like to add that I don't have to do what I'm doing. I'm a reservist, but I also I've just on the post-traumatic stress, I can leave my service if I want to. But I was also in a car accident, and I basically trashed one of my legs. I don't have to do what I'm doing. I'm volunteering in the end to do this. And every single person that I train is a volunteer. This is not mandatory reserve duty service. All the people that I'm training are all volunteers. And this is an extremely interesting aspect of what this is now. Generally speaking, Israelis do the reserve duty not just because it's mandatory, but because we want to protect our country. But there is something special about specifically the guys that I'm working with. Some of them are actually even active in other reserve units, but aside from that, they're also training as the settlement protection units. And so I'm just sort of like giving a shout out to all the guys that I train, because it is a really special type of person to do what they're doing. And sort of volunteer to go into these situations when they really don't have to. They don't have to do it if they don't want to. There's no one forcing anyone to be in these units.
Of course.
Can I ask you a question? You said that you changed your philosophy on life or the way you see the world. And I know myself, what seemed to help was to stop taking responsibility for the state of the world. There's only so much we can contribute and give before we're burnt out, or whatever the terminology is. But for me, it was just to kind of let go of all of that.
Well, the first thing is personal responsibility. I think a lot of us tend to blame everything and everyone around us for a situation, especially post-traumatic stress. With veterans, we blame the army, we blame our family, we blame everyone for us getting mad and for us not handling everything around us. It's personal responsibility about myself and how I walk and handle myself in the world. Now, when it comes to the world's problems, that is an added amount of stress. But again, I live in a country where I actually feel that if I sort of let go and I stop doing what I'm doing now, it's just a part. I feel responsible for what I'm doing. I feel responsible for the people I'm training. I feel responsible for the civilians that I'm hopefully saving. It's a lot of responsibility and stress, I think, around that. But you're right. It's much easier to sort of disconnect from what's going on around. And what I do has nothing to do with Israeli politics. I just believe in the rights of civilians to defend themselves. I disagree with with basically all of Israeli politics from the left and the right. But the only thing I completely am with is the right of civilians to defend themselves. So that's what I focus on. I'm trying to think about anything else.
Yeah, I think that says a lot about you and how you're made up. Let me ask you this: are there PTSD success stories? Can you get better? Is it possible?
Okay, so as I said, I don't think you can get 100% back to normal, to what you were before you entered the military and so forth. But again, as a human, you evolve. But I will tell you a story from the last big operation. I don't know what it's called in English, from Tzuk. I was treating a soldier. His unit got into an ambush with Hamas. A lot of guys died there. His best friend got shot and killed. And while they were retreating, they were moving back, they suddenly noticed that his body was still in the combat zone. So he volunteered, he went in, he was able to retrieve the body, and they moved out. Now, what happened was that the entire unit was put on standby, which is the worst thing you can do for a combat unit under that situation. You either put them back into combat, you take them out of combat, you don't leave them on standby. In the meantime, the funeral of his best friend was happening in the rear. Everyone was going through their mornings, through the morning and everything, and he was on standby for combat. And when the entire situation ended, he goes back into the regular life, and everyone has done their mourning, but he didn't have that chance. So he's still remembering everything, and he has survivor's guilt and all that stuff. And I'm sort of, he's already left the army. I met him about a year after the operation. He was already after the army, and he just didn't know what to do with his life. And we basically sat there and we talked and we did the acupuncture and we focused on talking to his friend and what did you want to say to your friend before he died, and what do you feel about the situation? What would he think about what you're doing right now with your life? And that was just one single treatment. And he went and he signed up for school. And he decided to go travel the world a bit. And he found a job. And all these things suddenly happened just from one session of sort of processing the whole situation. No one had sat him down and asked him, how are you doing? What's going on in your mind? Nobody he basically ignored. It's like, why aren't you continuing with your life? That's what you're expected to do. Everyone else has. Why haven't you? I find that the most problematic stuff for people with PTS is that they think that they're alone. And community, especially community within post-traumatic stress circles, is what mostly helps people to survive the day-to-day and sort of get on their feet and move around, and get back into regular life. For me, I have a couple of close friends that whenever one of us is sort of crashing from stuff that's sort of surfacing, we drop everything and we meet up and we talk and we maybe smoke or drink or, just be around each other. And that sort of pushes up together, and just basically knowing that we're not alone. Other people are going through this. And through treatment, which I believe in acupuncture and meditation, you can limit the things that happen to you. Like for me, I've been able to go back to sleep in general. I don't have the bodily pain that I used to have. I don't have the paranoia that I used to have. But every once in a while, something triggers it. And, you certainly have your flashbacks and stuff like that. It doesn't go completely away, but you can definitely go back to your life. But the first thing is personal responsibility, understanding that you have a problem and you need to deal with it.
I agree with that 100%. And thank you very much for sharing that with us today. It's fantastic.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's great stuff. I know that on that topic, that's where I started my journey of recovery, is when I was able to plug into, it was actually Jimmy that I first reached out to and spoke with. And when you start talking about it, that's that first step towards getting the help and towards confronting things and towards, recognizing. And conversely, you need people around you that can recognize the signs, the symptoms, something is just not right. And really it all comes down to just caring about each other, caring about everybody around you all the time, and asking, how are you? Not just in passing. We all throw these words. Hey, how you doing? What's up? How are you? Nobody cares for an answer. Nobody even answers honestly, because we all say good. How are you? Good. All right. Nice
I always attack them with the truth. You ask me a question, I'm going to answer it. It's your fault.
How much time do you have?
Yeah, but that's fascinating. That's amazing. I think we're coming up to our end of this session. I think we definitely have a lot more that we can talk about, and we definitely will set up some more sessions in the future. This interface all seemed to work good for us. We ironed out a little bit. This is our first time using this streaming program here. Thank you to Adam Kanakian, first of all, for your help in setting us up, and for Grant for all your wonderful work this morning and tying up all these technical ends. I think we got it down packed now, and we'll definitely move forward with some more sessions with you, Nadav. We have a lot of interesting things that we can bring to the table and discuss, and it's all very enlightening and fascinating, and it's great. Is there anything that you want to share in closing with the audience on anything?
It was a pleasure talking. I think we still have a lot to talk about, lots of different things that we didn't dive into in the end today, but we'll get there eventually, I suppose. Absolutely. This was fun. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
it was.
Thank
you.
No,
Appreciate
thank you,
it.
my friend. Thank you very much. Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you for what you're doing. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And stay tuned to our next Copcast session. Everybody stay safe. You need anything, you know where to reach us. We're signing off for today.
Signing off, brought to you by Valley Associates and Hudson Supplies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Kneel down in the underground where the science fiction starts. Gonna have it all my way, so we're both done playing parts.